Let me ask you something directly. When was the last time you looked at your cholesterol numbers and understood that they were not just numbers, not just a lab result, not just a doctor saying, it's a little high, not just a quick warning before you were handed a prescription and told to watch your diet? I mean, really understood what those numbers may be saying about your arteries, your heart, your future, and the next 10 or 20 years of your life. Because here is what most men over 45 do not fully realize until somebody finally explains it without sugarcoating it. LDL cholesterol usually does not hurt you dramatically. It does not send a warning pain. It does not force you to stop what you are doing and say, something is wrong. It does not tap you on the shoulder. It does not knock you to the floor. It works quietly, patiently, relentlessly. It settles into the walls of your arteries a little at a time, month after month, year after year. Sometimes for a decade before anything obvious appears on a scan, a stress test, or in an emergency room. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. You can feel completely fine while it is happening. Your energy may still feel decent. You may still work, travel, walk, laugh, sleep, and go through ordinary life with no dramatic symptom that points a finger at cholesterol. That is how men get caught. Not because they did not care, because nothing felt urgent. Then one day, a blood test comes back higher than expected, or a scan shows plaque. Or a doctor gets quieter than usual when reading your panel, and suddenly, the thing that felt abstract becomes personal. I'm Dr. Adrian. And after years of seeing men walk into clinics believing they had plenty of time, only to discover that their arteries had been changing quietly for years, I need to tell you something as clearly as I can. High LDL is not just a lab problem. It is an exposure problem, an artery problem, a long-term cardiovascular problem. And if you are a man over 45, there is a very real chance that one or two habits you still think are harmless are quietly helping drive that number higher. That is why this conversation matters, because most men do not need more vague advice. They do not need to be told to eat healthier and exercise more, and then be sent home with no real strategy. They need a plan, a specific plan, a plan built on mechanisms, not motivational slogans. A plan that explains not only what to do, but why it works. And that is exactly what I am going to give you today. 9 evidence-based strategies that can help lower LDL naturally. Not fantasy, not miracle claims, not supplement store fiction. Real strategies that change how your liver handles cholesterol, how your gut recycles bile acids, how your arteries are exposed to LDL particles over time, and how your next blood panel may look if you actually stay consistent. And I need you to stay with me through the second half of this because later, I am going to name 2 natural cholesterol supplements that millions of people are taking right now thinking they are choosing the safer path. One may expose you to a kidney-damaging toxin. The other has been linked to real liver injury. Both are marketed as natural support. Neither deserves blind trust. But first, we need to start with the foundation, because if you get this first part wrong, everything else becomes weaker. Strategy number 1. Stop fearing all fat. Start changing the type of fat. This is where a huge number of men waste years. They hear the word cholesterol and immediately assume the answer is to eat less fat. So they start cutting fat in random ways. Dry chicken breast, low-fat products, fat-free snacks loaded with starch. Less olive oil, fewer nuts, less fish, less avocado. They flatten the whole category and treat all fats like the same chemical mistake. That is where the misunderstanding begins, because not all fats behave the same way inside your body. Some help lower LDL. Some raise it, some worsen the whole lipid pattern. And if you lump them together, you miss one of the most powerful ways to move your number. Saturated fat is the real issue here. Butter, fatty cuts of red meat, processed meats, heavy cream, cheese in excess, full-fat dairy in excess, coconut oil for men whose LDL is already elevated. These fats send a signal to the liver that matters enormously. They reduce LDL receptor activity. And LDL receptors are one of the main ways your liver clears LDL particles out of the bloodstream. Fewer active receptors means less LDL gets removed, which means more LDL stays circulating, which means more opportunity for those particles to drift into artery walls. That is the mechanism. Now look at what happens when you replace those fats with polyunsaturated fats. Fish, walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds, certain plant oils used correctly. These fats support better LDL clearance. Monounsaturated fats like extra virgin olive oil, avocado, and almonds also improve the overall lipid environment without the same LDL-raising signal seen with saturated fat. So the goal is not eat less fat. The goal is upgrade the fat. That one mental shift changes everything. I remember a man in his early 50s who had spent months trying to go low-fat after a bad cholesterol result. He was eating dry toast, low-fat yogurt with added sugar, fat-free crackers, and skinless chicken. He thought he was doing the responsible thing. His LDL barely moved. Why? Because he removed some of the helpful fats while still living inside a pattern that did not really help his liver clear LDL any better. Once he changed the pattern properly, olive oil instead of butter, walnuts daily, fatty fish several times a week, less red meat, more avocado, his next panel looked different, not because he starved himself. Because he changed the signal his liver was receiving every day. That is where the leverage is. So what do you actually do? Make extra virgin olive oil your default fat, not your fancy fat, your default. Add a daily handful of walnuts. Get salmon, sardines, or mackerel onto your plate 2 to 3 times a week. And if red meat is still showing up frequently, reduce the frequency and portion size before you obsess over smaller details. Because if you get fat quality right, the rest of the system becomes much easier to improve. Now, strategy number 2. Your coffee may be quietly keeping your LDL higher than it should be. This one shocks people because it feels unfair. Men will clean up breakfast, walk daily, buy olive oil, cut back on processed meat, try harder, and still watch LDL move less than expected. And sometimes the reason is not dinner, not snacks, not dessert. It is what they are drinking every single morning. Specifically, unfiltered coffee, French press, boiled coffee, Turkish coffee. A lot of espresso in men who drink it heavily. These methods allow compounds called cafestol and coel to remain in the cup. And cafestol matters because it reduces LDL clearance by altering how the liver regulates cholesterol metabolism. That means your daily coffee ritual may be sending a repeated signal that quietly pushes LDL higher. This is one of those hidden levers people miss for years because coffee feels too ordinary to suspect. I remember a man who did almost everything right. He exercised, lost weight, cleaned up his food, became more disciplined, and still, his LDL barely budged. When we went through his routine carefully, the answer was sitting right there in his kitchen. French press coffee. 2 large mugs every morning. That was the hidden signal. He switched to paper-filtered coffee and kept everything else the same. Weeks later, the LDL dropped enough that the whole story finally made sense. That is what makes this so important. It is not about quitting coffee, it is about changing the delivery system. Paper filters trap most of the cafestol. That means paper-filtered drip coffee or pour-over coffee is metabolically different from French press in a way that actually matters. So if coffee is part of your daily life, do not just ask how much you drink, ask how you make it. That detail matters more than most people realize. Now, strategy number 3. Use soluble fiber like a real cholesterol-lowering tool. This is where nutrition becomes almost mechanical. Your digestive system is deeply involved in cholesterol metabolism. Most men never hear that clearly enough. They think cholesterol is only about what enters the bloodstream directly. They do not realize how much of the story lives in the gut. Here is why soluble fiber matters. Your liver uses cholesterol to make bile acids. Those bile acids are sent into the digestive system to help process fat. Normally, most of them get reabsorbed lower in the intestine and recycled back to the liver. That recycling loop is highly efficient. Soluble fiber interrupts it. It forms a gel-like substance that binds to bile acids and helps carry them out of the body, rather than allowing them to be reabsorbed. Now your liver has to make more bile acids. To do that, it pulls more cholesterol out of circulation. That is one of the cleanest natural ways to lower LDL. Not hype, not theory. Basic physiology. That is why oats matter. That is why psyllium matters. That is why beans, lentils, apples, pears, chia seeds, and similar foods are not just generally healthy. They are functional. They are doing something specific. I once had a man tell me, "I thought oatmeal was just bland old breakfast food," and that sentence told me everything. No one had ever explained the mechanism to him. Once he understood what soluble fiber was actually doing, those foods stopped feeling optional. They became part of the intervention. That mindset changed his consistency, and consistency changed his numbers. So what do? Start with oats in the morning. Real oats, not sugary packets pretending to be health food. Add chia or ground flaxseed. Use beans or lentils regularly, not occasionally. Reach for fruit that actually contributes soluble fiber instead of only reaching for refined starch. And if you consistently struggle to hit enough through food, psyllium husk is one of the few simple add-ons I actually respect from a cholesterol perspective. Not because it is trendy, because it works. Now, strategy number 4, replace some animal protein with plant protein. This works because it changes several things at once. When men hear, "eat less red meat," they often hear it as moral advice or diet culture noise. But metabolically, the point is much more serious. If you replace some red meat and processed meat with legumes, nuts, seeds, tofu, tempeh, and similar whole plant protein foods, you do not just reduce saturated fat. You increase fiber, you improve fat quality, you shift the amino acid profile of the meal, you change the whole LDL environment. That is why this works so well in real life. It is not one tiny effect, it is multiple helpful effects moving in the same direction. And let me say something clearly. This does not mean you have to become vegetarian. That is where many men shut down too fast. You do not need a new identity. You need smarter substitutions. A few lunches each week built around lentils, beans, hummus, tofu, nuts, or seeds instead of processed meat. A dinner where the protein is fish and legumes instead of steak and buttered potatoes. A breakfast that is not automatically built around processed meat. That is enough to matter. I had one patient who thought he had to choose between total dietary war and doing nothing. Once he realized that strategic substitution was enough, everything got easier, and that is always the difference. The men who improve their LDL the most are rarely the men who become perfect. They are the men who become strategic. Now, strategy number 5. Weight loss and exercise matter, but not for the simplistic reason most people think. Yes, if you are carrying excess body fat, especially around the abdomen, losing even 5 to 10% of your body weight can meaningfully improve LDL, triglycerides, insulin sensitivity, blood pressure, and overall cardiovascular risk. That is real. But I want to go deeper than just lose weight. Because exercise is not only about calories. It changes lipoprotein behavior. It improves insulin sensitivity. It reduces metabolic dysfunction. It helps shift LDL particles away from the smaller, denser, more dangerous type. That matters. Because two men can have similar LDL totals on paper and very different real-world risk depending on inflammation, insulin resistance, triglycerides, and particle characteristics. So when you move regularly, especially combining brisk walking with resistance training, you are not just burning off fat. You are changing the metabolic environment those particles live inside. I remember one man who started with the most basic plan imaginable. 25 minutes of walking most days, 2 short strength sessions each week, no gym obsession, no macho transformation fantasy, just consistency. Months later, his numbers improved enough that he finally believed what I had been telling him from the start. You do not need a heroic plan. You need a repeatable one. So if you are not active now, do not start with fantasy. Start with movement you can actually repeat. Walk most days, build toward 150 minutes a week, add resistance training twice weekly. And remember that exercise is not punishment for eating. It is a metabolic signal, a deep one. Now, strategy number 6. Your gut bacteria may be affecting your cholesterol more than you realize. This is where the story gets more interesting, because the microbiome is not just about digestion, bloating, or whether yogurt agrees with you. Certain gut bacteria help influence bile acid metabolism, and bile acids, as I told you earlier, are central to the cholesterol recycling story. When the microbiome is healthier and more diverse, the way bile acids are processed can shift in a direction that supports better cholesterol handling. That is one reason fermented foods deserve more respect than they usually get. Not because kimchi is fashionable, not because kefir is trendy, because regular fermented foods help support the kind of microbial environment that can improve the larger metabolic picture. Now, I want to be careful. I am not saying fermented foods alone will slash your LDL. That would be lazy medicine. I am saying that if you are already improving fat quality, fiber, movement, and protein choices, fermented foods can become part of the system that supports the whole pattern. Plain kefir, unsweetened yogurt with live cultures, kimchi, sauerkraut, miso, not once a month, regularly, quietly. The same way real health usually improves, not through drama, through repetition. Now, strategy number 7. Stop blaming eggs for everything. This one has confused men for decades. For years, eggs were treated like cholesterol bombs. And because that message was repeated so often, many men still carry it around as unquestioned truth. But the reality is more nuanced. For most healthy adults, 1 egg a day is not the catastrophe it was once made out to be. Dietary cholesterol does not automatically create the kind of LDL rise that saturated fat does in most people. The body is more sophisticated than the old story suggested. Now, that does not mean every person responds identically. Men with familial cholesterol disorders, type 2 diabetes, or certain high-risk patterns may need a more individualized discussion. But for the average man trying to improve cholesterol, eggs are rarely the main villain. What usually causes trouble is the company they keep. Butter, sausage, processed bacon, white bread loaded with spread, a breakfast built around saturated fat and refined carbs, with the egg unfairly taking all the blame. So do not waste your energy fighting the wrong enemy. Look at the whole meal. Not just the one ingredient with the bad reputation. Now, before I give you the final 2 strategies, I need to stop and tell you something important. Because many men do almost everything right and still quietly sabotage themselves with the wrong supplement. Not a prescription, a supplement, a natural solution. And this is where people get hurt, because they assume natural means safe. It doesn't. Natural is not the same thing as regulated. It is not the same thing as standardized. And it is definitely not the same thing as harmless. The first supplement I want to warn you about is red yeast rice. Let me be honest. Red yeast rice can lower LDL. That is why it became popular. But the reason it lowers LDL is not because it is magical. It lowers LDL because it contains compounds similar to statins. In other words, many people trying to avoid medication are essentially taking an unregulated medication-like substance instead. And here is the real problem. Some red yeast rice products have been found to contain citrinin, a toxin that can damage the kidneys. That is not theoretical. That is one of the exact reasons I do not trust it casually. The second problem is dose consistency. With a prescription, you know what you are getting. With an unregulated supplement, you often don't. So now you may be taking something statin-like without standardized dosing, without proper oversight, and with a contamination risk you never agreed to. That is not smart self-care. That is gambling. If your LDL is high enough that you likely need statin-level intervention, have the adult conversation with your doctor. Do not try to recreate prescription medicine in the supplement aisle with worse quality control. The second supplement I want you to be much more careful with is concentrated green tea extract in capsule form. Let me separate this clearly. Drinking green tea is not the problem. Green tea as a beverage is generally fine, and for many people it fits beautifully into a heart-conscious routine. But concentrated green tea extract capsules are different. There have been real cases of serious liver injury linked to high-dose green tea extract supplements. That matters, because once again, people buy them thinking they are choosing the safer, more natural path. And instead, they may be concentrating a plant compound to a level the liver does not handle well. That is the pattern I want you to watch for. Take something normal, concentrate it aggressively, put it in a capsule, market it as salvation. That should always trigger caution. Tea is one thing. A high-dose extract capsule sold with oversized promises is another. That is why I tell men this. Drink the tea. Be careful with the capsule. Now, strategy number 8. Build a real dietary pattern instead of chasing isolated fixes. This is where many men stall. They want the one food, the one trick, the one supplement, the one secret, the one thing that cancels everything else. That is not how LDL works. LDL responds best when the whole environment changes, and this is exactly why Mediterranean-style eating and DASH-style patterns perform so well in long-term research, because they do not depend on one magic bullet. They change the whole system at once. Better fats, more fiber, more plants, more legumes, less processed food, less saturated fat, less metabolic chaos. That is what the liver responds to, not heroics, patterns. Think about what happens when you stack the right changes together. You switch from butter to olive oil. You add oats and chia seeds every morning. You move from French press to paper-filtered coffee. You start eating salmon or sardines twice a week. You reduce processed meat. You add beans or lentils several times per week. You include fermented foods. You walk daily. No single step is dramatic, but together, they become exactly the kind of coherent signal the body responds to. That is when LDL starts dropping in ways that feel real. That is when doctors start asking what changed. Now, strategy number 9. Stop chasing perfection. Start chasing consistency. This may be the most important thing in the entire video, because the men who improve their cholesterol the most are almost never the men who become perfect overnight. They are not the men who never eat dessert again, never miss a workout, never drink wine, never have a burger, never take a lazy weekend. They are the men who choose the right direction and stay with it long enough for the blood test to catch up. That is the real game. Consistency. Because cholesterol is not a one-day number. It is a pattern number. It is the reflection of repeated exposure, repeated food choices, repeated routines, repeated signals to the liver. Your next blood panel is not going to judge you based on one dinner. It is going to reflect the environment you created over the previous weeks and months. That should be deeply encouraging, because it means you do not need perfection. You need repeatability. You need something sustainable. You need a plan that still exists after motivation fades. I have seen men make major improvements not because they were saints, but because they built a pattern that survived ordinary life. That is the difference. The men who win are not always the most intense. They are the most consistent. So here is what I want you to take away from all of this. Lowering LDL naturally is not about fear. It is not about starving yourself. It is not about declaring war on every enjoyable part of your life. It is about understanding what actually moves the number. Upgrade fat quality. Filter your coffee. Use soluble fiber strategically. Shift some protein from animal to plant sources. Move your body. Support your gut. Stop blaming the wrong foods. Be careful with fake natural shortcuts. Build a real pattern. And repeat it long enough for your arteries to feel the difference, even before your blood test proves it. Let me leave you with this. You may feel fine right now. That is exactly why this is the time to act. Because LDL rarely punishes you immediately. It punishes delay. It punishes indifference. It punishes the assumption that feeling okay means being okay. So if your doctor has told you that your LDL is creeping upward, do not treat that like background noise. Treat it like early information, useful information, actionable information, information you can still use while the story is still changeable. Because 8 weeks from now, your doctor really could look at your blood work and ask, what exactly have you been doing? And the best answer in the world would be this: the right things, consistently. That is how numbers change. That is how risk changes. And that is how the next 10 years of your life can look very different from the last 10.